She slammed both palms against the black SUV as if steel were the last solid thing left in the world. The vehicle had just rolled through the private gate when she appeared out of the darkness beyond the headlights, barefoot, breath tearing in her throat, a thin hospital band still clinging to one wrist like proof she had fled somewhere she was never meant to leave. Gravel bit into her feet. The guards shouted at once, jackets opening, hands moving toward the weight at their hips, but the young woman did not run when the beams pinned her in place. She turned halfway, looked back toward the road she had come from, and then struck the hood again with the flat of her hand. Not to attack, to warn. The engine idled low and expensive, warm metal ticking under the cold night air, while in the distance another sound rose fast, a pair of motorcycles cutting through the silence like knives through silk. Elena did not speak. She only shook her head once, violently, and threw herself toward the driver's side as the bikes burst through the outer curve of the driveway. The first rider lifted an arm. A flash of chrome, not a gun but a syringe glinting under the gate lights, and suddenly every man in Adrian Varela's courtyard understood the girl had not stumbled into the estate by accident. She had chosen this place, chosen this car, chosen him, though she could not possibly know who sat behind the tinted glass. The rear door opened before a guard could reach for it. Adrian stepped out in a charcoal suit that looked untouched by the hour, one hand bare, the other still holding the phone he had been using moments earlier. He did not ask who she was. His eyes went first to the hospital band, then to the torn seam at her shoulder, then to the bruised red marks around her left forearm that did not look fresh enough to come from tonight alone. Elena saw him and flinched, not from him, but from the movement behind him, the men, the weapons, the whole geometry of power closing around her. Then she did something stranger than running. She moved in front of him. The first motorcycle skidded sideways at the fountain, tires screaming over stone. One rider jumped off before the bike fully stopped and rushed forward with the syringe angled low. Elena grabbed Adrian's sleeve with freezing fingers and pulled, trying to drag him one step back, while placing herself between him and the attacker. It was clumsy, desperate, and completely irrational unless she believed whatever was in that needle mattered more than her own safety. A guard intercepted the man before he got within 3 feet, slamming him to the ground hard enough to send the syringe spinning across the marble. The second rider veered away and disappeared through the half-open gate under a spray of sparks and curses. The first was pinned face down, wrists twisted behind him. Adrian never looked at the captive. He was looking at Elena. She had gone still in the aftermath, chest rising too fast, eyes fixed not on the fallen attacker, but on the syringe rolling in a slow circle until it stopped against the toe of Adrian's shoe. He crouched, not enough to touch it, only enough to inspect. Clear liquid. No label. Professional. Deliberate. When he rose, Elena took a step back as if the object itself had memory. "Search him," Adrian said quietly. "Alive." The order landed like a lock clicking shut. His men moved. The courtyard lights threw long white bars across the stone, and the scent of gasoline from the wrecked bike mixed with clipped hedges and gun oil. Elena's lips parted once, but no sound came. One of the guards reached for her elbow, likely to restrain her, maybe to move her out of the way. She recoiled so sharply she nearly lost her footing. Adrian lifted 2 fingers without turning his head. The guard stopped. It was a small gesture, almost lazy, but the whole yard obeyed it. Elena noticed. People who had spent their lives around danger noticed power the way burned skin noticed heat. Adrian stepped closer, slowly enough that she could retreat if she wanted to. She did not. Not because she trusted him. Because whatever had chased her here terrified her more than the man standing in front of his own armed estate like he owned the night. "What hospital?" he asked. No answer. Her gaze dropped to the band at her wrist, as if she had forgotten it was there. Then, with sudden urgency, she clawed at it herself, skin scraping, trying to tear it off. Adrian caught her hand before she could. Not rough. Exact. The plastic snapped anyway, leaving half the band in his fingers. St. Dymphna Behavioral Center, it read, the ink smudged but legible under the security light. Elena stared at the words now visible between them, and something in her face changed. Not weakness, not embarrassment, something harder, like a door slamming shut from the inside. She pulled free and back toward the SUV again, searching the road over Adrian's shoulder, every muscle braced for impact. The guard searching the captured rider called out from the stones near the fountain. No ID. Burner phone. One photo only. He held it up. Adrian took the phone and glanced at the screen. A grainy image, zoomed from a distance, showed Elena stepping through what looked like a service exit behind a medical facility less than an hour earlier. Across the bottom, a single text message remained unsent. Confirm when asset is recovered. Adrian's expression did not move, but the air around him changed. This was no random runaway. Not a thief. Not a decoy picked up off the street. Someone had contained her, tracked her, and sent retrieval, not rescue. He turned the screen so Elena could see it. Her eyes hit the word asset, and all the blood seemed to leave her face. She reached for the phone, stopped short of touching it, then slowly pressed a trembling finger to her own chest as if to say me, and just as slowly shook her head. No, whatever that word meant, she was denying it with the only weapon she still seemed to have. Adrian studied her for one long second, then looked toward the open gate where the second rider had escaped. Close the property, he said. No one in or out without my voice. Metal groaned as the gate rolled shut behind them. It sounded final. Elena heard it and spun toward the entrance, panic flashing so visibly now that even the men pretending not to watch shifted where they stood. She was trapped. On another night, she might have bolted anyway, but the road beyond the gate was dark, exposed, and already hunting her. Adrian extended the broken half of the hospital band. You came here for a reason, he said. Until I know what it is, you don't leave. She stared at the plastic in his hand, then at the bloodless syringe near his shoe, then at the sealed gate. The choice had already been made the moment she hit his car, but now the truth of it settled over the courtyard in cold, silent layers. Elena had fallen into Adrian's world carrying a secret dangerous enough to be retrieved like property, and Adrian had decided she belonged nowhere else tonight. Rain had started sometime during the lockdown, a thin silver mist hissing against the stone courtyard and darkening the black SUVs lined beneath the cypress trees. The smell of wet earth mixed with gun oil and antiseptic, and under the yellow spill of the security lamps, the snapped hospital band in Adrian's hand looked less like plastic now and more like a tag torn off something that was never meant to escape. Elena did not move when the last gate motor groaned shut. Water clung to her hair in loose strands, and the white of the institutional shirt beneath the borrowed coat flashed each time the wind opened it at the throat. Around them, Adrian's men waited in a hard semicircle, weapons lowered but not holstered, their eyes shifting from the syringe on the ground to the woman who had chosen a Mafia boss's car over the night behind her. Adrian looked once toward the bodyguard holding the burner phone in a gloved hand. Inside, he said, not to comfort her, not to ask permission, to claim the next move before anyone else could. The main hall swallowed the storm behind them with a heavy oak thud. Warm air rolled over polished marble floors, carrying cedar smoke from a low fire and the clean bite of disinfectant from the med kit one of his men had opened on a console table. Elena stopped at the threshold as if some invisible wire had caught around her ribs. Light from a chandelier spilled across brass fixtures, framed oil paintings, the long dining table sharp as a blade. And for one brief second her eyes snagged not on the men, not on Adrian, but on the wall mirrors that reflected every exit at once. Adrian saw it. Not vanity. Calculation. A hunted person checked doors. A trained one checked sightlines. Everyone out except Mateo, he said. Several heads turned. He rarely narrowed a room for strangers. Boots crossed marble, jackets whispered, and soon only the fire, the rain against high windows, and the faint electronic chirp of the estate's security grid filled the silence. Mateo set the burner phone on the table beside the syringe and stepped back. Adrian approached Elena slowly enough that the movement itself became a test. No flinch when he neared her left side. A sharp recoil when his hand lifted near her right shoulder. Small, fast, instinctive. His eyes dropped to the seam of the coat. Take it off. Her fingers tightened at the collar. Now. She obeyed, but not like someone yielding, like someone conserving strength. The coat slid to the floor, damp and heavy, and beneath the thin institutional fabric, a lattice of fading bruises showed along her forearms where restraint straps might have sat too long. Near her clavicle, half hidden by the torn neckline, a dark yellow fingerprint mark was already turning old. Mateo exhaled through his nose. Adrian said nothing for several seconds. Silence, in his house, was rarely empty. It measured people. It made them reveal what they could not say. He picked up the syringe with a handkerchief and turned it beneath the lamplight. Not street narcotics. Clean barrel. Precise dosage marks. Professional. The kind used to bring someone back under control, not to kill them in a gutter. Then he took the burner phone, opened the image again, and held it beside her face. Same eyes. Same mouth. Same woman. Tagged like inventory. You ran from St. Dymphna. No answer. Men followed you here with this. He set the phone down. They didn't call you a patient. Her throat moved once, the smallest swallow. Adrian leaned one hand against the table, close enough for her to see he was not guessing anymore. They called you an asset. At that, her gaze dropped instantly to the marble floor. Not confusion. Recognition. The room tightened. Matteo caught it too, shifting his weight near the fireplace. Adrian straightened. The answer he needed tonight was no longer whether she was being hunted. That had been settled in the courtyard. The answer now was whether she was bait, liability, witness, or something valuable enough to start a war over. He reached for the crystal decanter on the sideboard, poured 2 fingers of water instead of whiskey, and set the glass in front of her. She stared at it as if the surface might betray her. Drink. Her hand shook before it even touched the glass. Not at the order. At the sound of ice settling in a bucket nearby. A tiny clink, almost nothing. Yet the noise hit her harder than the men with guns had. The glass slipped, struck the table edge, and shattered across the marble in a spray of bright fragments. Elena stumbled backward, breath snagging soundlessly, both hands up though no one had raised one against her. Adrian's eyes narrowed. Not random fear. Conditioned response. Someone had taught her body to answer small sounds, as if punishment followed. Matteo moved on reflex to restrain her before she cut herself, but Adrian's arm shot out, blocking him. Don't touch her. The command landed cold and final. Matteo froze mid-step. Elena stood rigid beside the broken water, chest lifting too fast, bare feet inches from the glass. Adrian bent, not to help, but to look closer. Along the inside of her wrist, hidden under damp fabric and old discoloration, sat a small sequence of numbers in faded black ink. Not a tattoo made for pride. A mark made for tracking. He did not ask what it meant. Not yet. He only stood and made a decision that changed every law inside the house. No one questions her without me. No one moves her. No one reports her presence outside this estate. Matteo stared at him. Boss, if she belongs to someone, she doesn't belong to anyone in my house. The words came out low enough to make the fire seem loud. It was not mercy. It was ownership of the board, of the timing, of the violence that might follow. Adrian crossed to the security panel inset in the wall and keyed in a new command. Steel shutters began descending over the first-floor windows with a muted mechanical growl. Locks engaged in sequence through the corridors beyond. The estate was no longer merely closed. It was sealed around her. Elena watched the shutters come down, watched the last strips of rain-dark glass disappear behind reinforced steel, and something in her face altered. Not relief, not trust, but the stunned recognition of a cage chosen over the hunters outside. Adrian turned back to her. You had your chance to run in the courtyard. His voice stayed even, almost quiet, which made it worse. Now you stay where I can see you until I know what you really are. She did not answer. She only looked from the coded numbers on her wrist to the burner phone on the table, then to the man who had just refused to hand her over and refused to let her go. In that widening silence, the power in the room shifted for real. The men outside the gates had lost access to her, and Elena had lost the right to disappear. Adrian signaled toward the corridor leading deeper into the house. Take her to the east suite. 2 guards outside the door. Inside, no restraints. Matteo hesitated, then nodded and reached not for her arm, but for the fallen coat. Elena did not move at first. Then, with the faint rustle of damp fabric and bare soles whispering over heated marble, she walked where she was told. Halfway to the corridor, she stopped and turned back just enough to look at Adrian over her shoulder. Not pleading, measuring, as if trying to decide whether the man who had closed every exit tonight had saved her from the dark or simply gotten there first. Behind her, the broken glass still glittered under chandelier light like ice around a wound, and Adrian, watching the coded number on her wrist vanish into shadow, understood one thing with dangerous clarity. Ordinary victims did not react to comfort like a threat, and whatever Elena had escaped, it had taught her to fear recovery more than capture. Air conditioning hummed through the east wing with the dry chill of a hospital trying to pretend it was a home, and somewhere beyond the shuttered windows rain tapped the stone balustrade in thin, impatient clicks. A tray Mateo had left outside the suite sat untouched on the Persian runner, steam long gone from the tea, the silver spoon cold against china. By the time Adrian stepped through the half-open door, the room already looked disturbed in ways no one else would have noticed at first glance. The lamp near the chaise had been turned toward the wall. The water glass on the nightstand moved 3 inches off-center, the heavy drapes pinned together with the decorative cord as if someone had needed to close every slit of black glass by hand. Elena stood in the far corner beside the wardrobe, not hiding exactly, but keeping the polished wood at her back the way a person kept concrete behind them in a storm. She had changed into the clothes left for her, soft gray knit and loose black pants, but the sleeves were tugged low over her wrists until her knuckles whitened. Adrian let the door click shut and said nothing. Silence, he had already learned, made most frightened people speak. With Elena, it made the room sharper. Her gaze flicked first to his hands, then to the inside of his jacket, then to the brass lock. Counting exits, measuring distance. He crossed only as far as the table and removed his watch, his phone, the small folding knife from his pocket, setting each object down where she could see it under the amber lamp glow. Metal touched, wood with 3 soft clicks. "No one's coming in here without my say," he said. Her shoulders tightened anyway, not at his voice, at the scrape of chair legs in the hallway beyond the door. A guard shifted outside, and Elena recoiled so fast the wardrobe behind her gave a dull thud against the wall. Adrian looked at the door, then back at her. "Mateo," he called, not raising his voice. "Move the post to the end of the corridor." Footsteps obeyed at once, receding over marble, and something in Elena's posture changed by a fraction, still rigid, but no longer braced for impact from one side. That was when Adrian understood the fear had rules. It was not chaos. It had triggers. He picked up the tray himself and carried it inside, replacing the untouched tea with a bottle of water from the bar cabinet, the seal unbroken. Her eyes followed the plastic crackle when he twisted the cap. She didn't reach for it until he drank first. Then the bottle touched her lower lip with both her hands wrapped around it, as if warmth and proof were the same thing. Minutes later, a housemaid entered only long enough to lay fresh towels by the bath, keeping her head down as instructed. The woman wore a perfume too powdery, too sweet. Elena's reaction was instant and violent, not theatrical, not loud. She just dropped the bottle, and the water rolled under the bed while she stumbled backward hard enough to hit the molding, breath trapped somewhere high in her chest. Adrian was beside the maid before the woman understood what she had done. "Out," he said, and the single word emptied the air. Once the door closed again, he saw Elena staring not at the maid's face, but at the white towel left folded on the bench. White terry cloth. Hospital white. Institutional white. Adrian took the towels, opened the suite's fireplace screen, and fed the whole stack into the unlit grate anyway, leaving them there like a warning. Then he walked to the linen closet himself and returned with dark wool blankets, thick and coarse, nothing sterile about them. He placed one on the armchair nearest the window and stepped back. Elena did not sit, but her breathing slowed enough for him to hear rain again. "You're not reacting to people," he said, watching her eyes rather than forcing her to meet his. "You're reacting to patterns." No answer. Just those fingers still hooked in the sleeves, knuckles pale as candle wax. He tested the room the way a locksmith tested a seized mechanism. He turned off the overhead chandelier. She eased half an inch. He opened the drapes an inch. She flinched. He shut them again. He moved the armchair away from the center of the room and against the wall. She finally crossed the carpet, one careful step at a time, and sat where no one could stand behind her. There it was. Not comfort. Positioning. Survival by angles. Adrian crouched by the fallen bottle and found, near the bed leg, not just the water, but a sliver of hard plastic no bigger than a thumbnail. It must have slipped from the hem of the borrowed pants when she changed. He turned it in the lamplight. A fragment from a hospital wristband, torn clean through one side, with the adhesive still clinging to the back and part of a printed code smeared by sweat. Elena saw it and moved for the first time with intention toward him. One step, then another, hand out. Not asking, demanding. Adrian rose before she could take it, and the sudden nearness stopped her cold. Her mouth parted. No sound came. He held the scrap between two fingers, not high enough to taunt, just beyond reach enough to make the truth plain. This tiny thing mattered more to her than the locked door, the armed guards, even her own freedom. He did not ask what it meant. That would have been the old move, the obvious move, and tonight he wanted the shape of her cage more than another silence. Instead, he tore the plastic in half and dropped both pieces into the fireplace with the white towels. Elena stared at him as if he had just broken a law she had lived under for years. "Whatever they tagged you with," he said, voice low and even, "it has no authority here." For a long second, she did not blink. Then, slowly, she lowered herself into the armchair, not trusting him, not thanking him, but no longer looking at the door as if she had to run before dawn. The change was small, almost invisible, yet it redrew the whole room. Adrian turned toward the exit and opened it to find Matteo waiting in the corridor's dim gold light. "Strip this wing," Adrian said. "No white linens. No floral perfume. No unnecessary staff. Quiet shoes only." Matteo frowned once, absorbing the oddity, then nodded. "And the cameras?" Adrian's gaze slid back to Elena, curled tense, but seated at last with the coarse blanket in both fists. "Hallway only," he said. "Nothing inside." Matteo took that in too, because it was not how Adrian handled unknown risks. It was, however, how a man handled evidence he intended to keep intact. When the door shut again, Elena remained in the chair, eyes open, chin lifted a fraction. She still had not given him a name beyond the one on the burner phone, had not offered one word he could trust, but now Adrian knew something more dangerous than any label recovered from the men outside. Whoever had controlled her had done it with routines precise enough to live in muscle, scent, cloth, and light. And if that kind of violence had been organized, then somewhere beyond the rain and the locked gates there were people who would notice very soon that their conditioning was beginning to fail. The scent reached him before the evidence did. Antiseptic trapped beneath detergent, sharp and institutional, wrong for a private estate lined with cedar polish and old stone. Rain tapped against the long east wing windows, soft but relentless, while Matteo stood just inside the suite with a sealed evidence pouch resting on his palm like something that could still bite. Adrian turned from the doorway, cufflinks catching the amber lamplight, and looked first at the pouch, then at Elena. She had gone still in the armchair again, too still, her bare feet drawn back from the rug as if distance alone could keep memory from crossing the room. Matteo said nothing until Adrian held out his hand. Inside the pouch lay what one of the men outside had dropped during the struggle and what nobody had thought important at first: a folded transport slip, damp at the edges, and a laminated access card cracked across one corner. St. Dymphna's name ran across both in sterile blueprint. Adrian opened the slip with 2 fingers. The paper gave off the sour smell of rainwater and pocket lint. Most of the lines were coded, numbers and transfer marks, but one field had been typed plainly enough to insult anyone reading it. Receiving authority. A name sat there in black block letters. Not a doctor, not a state office, not a clinic administrator. Adrian's gaze sharpened. The room seemed to lower its own voice. He knew the name. Everybody in his world knew it, though they usually spoke it carefully and only indoors. Councilman Esteban Mercer. Public donor. Reform Committee darling. Patron of half the city's behavioral recovery initiatives. A man photographed beside judges, bishops, and children with scholarship plaques in their hands. Matteo looked up at Adrian, waiting for the denial that did not come. "The card was in the jacket of the one with the syringe," he said. "Same pocket as the burner." Adrian read the line again, then turned the slip over. On the back, stamped in fading red ink, was a destination code tied to a private loading entrance downtown. One Adrian had seen before on manifests that never passed through customs and never appeared in daylight accounting. Not hospital traffic. Controlled transfer. Restricted chain. Elena's fingers curled so hard around the armrest that the tendons stood out under her skin. She was watching the paper now, not the men. Adrian crossed to the side table, took a silver letter opener, and slid it beneath the cracked card's laminate. A smaller insert came free from the plastic sleeve, hidden behind the visible identification layer. That was where the lie ended. Beneath the official formatting sat a second line in machine print. M. Voss authorization note. Adrian's eyes lifted slowly. It was not surprise that changed his face. Surprise was for men who still believed power wore the same suit in public that it wore in private. Mercer was connected, yes, but Mercer did not move human cargo through hidden channels on his own. Matthias Voss did. Voss, who financed private security firms, bought silence by the building, and dined with men who ordered disappearances between courses. A civic mask on one side, a butcher's bookkeeping on the other. Elena made a sound then, small and involuntary, less than a word. Not for Mercer, for Voss. Adrian heard the difference. Matteo heard it too, and his jaw locked. Adrian set the access insert flat on the table and looked at Elena without softening his voice. You know that name. Her throat moved once. No answer came, but she had already given more than she realized. She wasn't reacting to a rumor or to some distant political benefactor tied to paperwork. Her body had recognized the true owner of the chain before her mind could hide it. Adrian walked to the window, rain-smudged city light glinting beyond the grounds, and made one short call. No greetings. No wasted words. Freeze every contract route connected to Mercer's recovery charities, he said. Quietly. Pull shell boards, drivers, warehouse leases, private med supply invoices. Especially downtown loading access. He listened for 3 seconds, then added, no seizures yet. I want the map before I light the house. He ended the call and slipped the phone back into his jacket. That was the moment the situation changed. Until then, Elena had been a pursued woman with patterns carved into her nerves by some organized hand. Now she was connected to a network shielded by a man the city trusted and powered by another man the underworld feared enough not to mention casually. Protecting her was no longer just containment. It was interference. It meant that whoever wanted her back had reach in both polished rooms and locked ones. Matteo stared at the transport slip again. If Mercer signed the public side and Voss owned the back channel, he didn't finish. He didn't have to. Adrian did not answer at once. He was watching Elena instead. In the muted gold light, with the rain whispering against the glass and the old vents breathing low through the walls, she looked less like a runaway than a witness no court had ever been meant to hear. Not because she had spoken, but because every object in the room had begun speaking around her. The wrist mark, the hidden fragment, the syringe, the access note, the wrong name on the right paper. Adrian moved back toward the chair and crouched just enough to bring his eyes level with hers without touching her. Mercer opens doors, he said quietly. Voss moves what goes through them. Her breath caught. There it was again, that recoil not from theory, but from memory. He let the silence stand between them for one beat, then rose. Whatever Elena had been before she ran, whatever they had called her, whatever use they had built around her, one truth had become impossible to ignore. She was tied to a figure powerful enough to make judges smile for cameras and monsters disappear from records. And if that name was truly in her past, then the men with the syringe had been the smallest part of what was coming. Adrian folded the transport slip with deliberate care, slid it back into the pouch, and handed it to Matteo. No one outside this wing hears those names from your mouth, he said. Matteo nodded once. Adrian's next order came without heat, which made it heavier. Double the interior rotation. No uniforms in her sight line. Burn every visitor list from the last 48 hours and rebuild from the gates inward. Elena's eyes shifted to him then, sharp with a question she still could not force into speech. Why keep her now that the cost had become visible? Adrian held her gaze, unreadable as carved stone. He had found what the night had been hiding, and it was bigger than a frightened woman in a locked suite. It reached into City Hall, into transport channels, into a name that could start a war simply by being spoken in the wrong room. Outside, thunder rolled far off over the wet dark. Inside, Adrian made his decision in the open, where Elena could see it and Matteo could carry it. If Voss has a claim on her, he said, each word landing clean, then from this moment on, he has a problem with me. Rain pressed softly against the tall east wing windows, a fine ticking over glass and black stone, while the house held that expensive silence only old money and armed men could afford. The lamp beside the chaise cast a pool of amber over the rug, warming the silk edge of a blanket Elena had not really been using. And somewhere farther down the corridor, a door latch clicked once, then twice, too careful to belong to anyone who lived there without permission. Adrian was still in the suite when the sound came, one hand resting on the back of a leather chair, the transport slip and access insert already gone from sight. Elena heard it too. Her spine locked before her head even turned, and the porcelain cup Mateo had left untouched on the side table trembled against its saucer with one dry little tap. Adrian did not ask if she was afraid. He crossed the room with the kind of stillness that made other men move faster around him, lifted 2 fingers toward Mateo at the threshold, and the guard vanished into the hall without a word. Then the lights died. Not the suite alone. The whole east wing dropped into a dark so complete that the storm outside flashed silver across the windows like sheet metal. For half a breath, there was only rain, Elena's quickened breathing, and the low hum of emergency power trying to wake. Then came the first hard sound from below, a muffled crack, not thunder this time, followed by the alarm's sharp electronic stutter before it cut off mid-cry. Adrian's jaw tightened once. Whoever had come for her had not come to watch. "Stay behind me," he said, and this time Elena obeyed before fear could turn obedience into thought. Mateo's voice came through the small radio clipped under his jacket, broken by static. "South Garden Breach. 2 down. Van at the service road." Adrian took the radio from him, his eyes staying on the dark hall. "Seal the west staircase. Keep them away from this wing." A burst of shouting rose from the lower floor, then the splintering slam of something heavy striking wood. The estate, all polished floors and museum silence minutes before, suddenly sounded alive in the ugliest way. Boots on marble, men barking over each other, a distant window shattering into a spray of glass. Elena flinched at that sound as if it belonged to another year, another building. Adrian caught it. Not the fear alone, the recognition. He guided her toward the interior dressing room where the walls were thicker and the only light came from a red backup strip near the baseboard, thin as a wound. "No windows," Mateo said, moving to cover the door. "Safer." Elena stopped so abruptly that the blanket slid from her shoulders and pulled at her feet. Her hand shot out and caught the brass edge of the vanity. No windows was not what reached her. It was safer. The word seemed to turn in her like a key. She shook her head once, violently, then pointed, not at herself, not at the hall, but toward Adrian's desk, where the folder with Voss's name had been. Adrian followed the gesture. "They're not here to kill you," he said quietly, putting the pieces together as the house shook with another impact from below. "They're here to take you back." Her eyes shut for one beat. Confirmation. That changed the room more than the gunfire downstairs. An assassin could be answered with force. Recovery teams, transport chains, live extraction, that belonged to a system with money, permissions, replacement vehicles, people already planning the route out. Adrian turned to Mateo. "Burn the road access. Lock the front gates open, not shut. If they want speed, we make them choose exposure." Mateo did not hesitate. He moved. Agency passed cleanly from command to execution, and the estate shifted with it. Seconds later, through the rain-fogged glass, floodlights snapped on across the eastern lawn, bleaching hedges and wet gravel in surgical white. A black van lunged from the service road too early, wheels spitting water as it cut wide under the lights. Men in dark jackets broke from cover and then faltered, suddenly visible. Shots were exchanged somewhere beyond the fountain, sharp and fast, but Adrian was already moving Elena through the private passage that connected the suite to an older interior corridor lined with cold plaster and framed oil portraits gone ghostly in the backup glow. She resisted at the first turn, not because she wanted to stay, because she wanted to break away. Adrian felt it in the twist of her arm and the direction of her body, toward the opposite stair, toward the side of the house, where a person trying to save others would run if she believed herself to be the fire. "No," he said. She tried anyway, wrenching free just enough to stumble 2 steps into the corridor. Bare feet slapped the runner. For one wild instant she was faster than the men around her, because desperation often is, but the house had already become a cage designed by someone richer and more patient than panic. Mateo intercepted from the lower landing, catching her before she reached the bend. She fought without words, all breath and elbows and raw refusal. And in that struggle the truth became plainer than any confession. She was not trying to escape Adrian. She was trying to remove herself from his war before her presence buried everyone in it. Adrian came down the corridor toward her through the red emergency light, coat open, expression cut from winter. Behind him, another burst of radio chatter snapped with the words "Second Team" and East Wall. The attack had not been a probe. It had been timed, equipped, and willing to hit his home. "Look at me," he said. She didn't. He crouched anyway, bringing his face level with hers while Mateo slowly loosened his grip without fully letting her go. Rainwater and gun smoke drifted in from somewhere below, mixing with the clean medicinal scent that still clung faintly to Elena's skin no matter how many hours had passed. "If you run now, they take you. If you stay, they come harder." His voice stayed low, almost calm, which made the next words land colder. "Either way, this has already begun." Another impact shuddered through the floorboards under their feet. Somewhere in the front of the house, a man cried out and was cut short. Elena's struggle drained all at once, not into safety but into a terrible stillness, the kind that comes when a person sees the cost has spread beyond her control. Adrian watched that understanding settle over her face and made his decision before she could spend herself on another attempt. He stood and looked to Mateo. "Move her to the vault room beneath the chapel stairs. 2 men at the outer door. No sedatives. No restraints unless I give the order." Mateo nodded. Elena lifted her head sharply at that, at the mercy hidden inside the command even now, and Adrian held her gaze only long enough to make the next change undeniable. "And bring me every live one we catch." The storm rolled over the estate as Mateo led her away, the backup lights painting the corridor in blood-thin lines while Adrian turned toward the gunfire instead of away from it. The first attack had answered one question with brutal clarity. Voss's network was desperate enough to strike his house in the dark, which meant the next answer would have to come from someone who had walked onto his land tonight, expecting to leave with Elena in chains. Backup lights hummed behind the chapel walls, turning the narrow vault room into a wash of red and shadow, while dust drifted in the stale air like ash that had forgotten how to fall. Above them, gunfire no longer came in frantic bursts but in measured cracks, farther apart now, the kind of spacing that meant Adrian's men were winning and someone somewhere had started talking. Mateo stood by the steel door with a rifle low against his chest, listening to the comms in his earpiece, his jaw set hard enough to carve. When Elena moved, it was not toward the cot or the water bottle on the crate beside her. It was toward the old service hatch cut into the stone behind a row of storage shelves, a black seam half hidden by prayer candles boxed in damp cardboard. She had noticed it the moment Mateo locked them in. She waited until his attention tilted upward with the distant noise, then crossed the room in 3 noiseless steps and shoved the shelf with both hands. Wood legs scraped over concrete with a dry scream. Mateo turned instantly. "Stop." She did not. Her fingers found the rusted ring in the hatch and pulled until iron bit her palms. The panel lifted 3 inches before Mateo reached her, catching the weight of it with one hand and her wrist with the other. She twisted hard enough to bruise herself free, not fighting like someone trying to escape a prison, but like someone trying to outrun a sentence already chosen. Her breath came thin and quick. The red light hit the old marks circling her wrist and made them look almost fresh. "If you go out there, they'll see you before you hit the garden wall," Mateo said. "Then let them." The words came ragged, forced past a throat that had spent too long refusing language. It was not courage that sharpened them. It was surrender. For a beat, even Mateo froze. Not because she had spoken much, but because of what she had chosen to spend those few words on. Not to ask for help. Not to beg. To remove herself. Elena lunged again, this time ducking under his arm and dropping to one knee to force the hatch wider. Cold night air leaked up from the shaft beneath, carrying wet earth, engine smoke, and the metallic tang of rain on stone. Mateo caught her around the shoulders and hauled her back before she could slip through. She drove an elbow into his ribs, desperate, clumsy, effective enough to make him grunt. The shelf tipped and a row of votive glass rolled across the floor, chiming into the wall. "Enough," he snapped, pinning her hands without striking her, wrestling not with defiance but with panic stripped of disguise. He gave an order. Elena's head jerked toward the ceiling as another muffled shot traveled through the chapel foundations. Her whole body tightened. There it was at last, plain and terrible. She was not trying to save herself from Adrian. She was trying to save Adrian from whatever followed her. Mateo saw it the same second he felt her stop resisting and start shaking instead, not from weakness but from the effort of holding one decision together. If she remained here, more men would come. More blood would answer for her silence. He keyed his radio with one hand, still keeping her from the hatch. "Boss," he said, breath rough, "she just tried to leave through the service tunnel." Static cracked. Then Adrian's voice arrived low and flat through the earpiece, carrying the cold steadiness of a man standing inside the aftermath of violence without letting it touch his pulse. "Did she get out?" "No." A short pause. "Why?" Mateo looked at Elena, at the mud on the hem of the borrowed clothes, at the way her eyes stayed fixed on the dark opening as if it led less to freedom than to proper sacrifice. "To draw them off," he said quietly. Silence answered for a second, heavier than the gunfire had been. Somewhere above, a door slammed. Men shouted. Adrian spoke again. "Seal the tunnel. Bring her upstairs. West Hall. No windows." Mateo cut the line and stared at her as if he had just been handed a different person than the one he had escorted downstairs. "You think leaving fixes this?" Elena's lips parted, then closed. Her gaze dropped to his grip on her wrists, then to the floor. She did not plead. She did not fight again. That frightened him more than the struggle had. He shoved the hatch down with his boot until iron struck stone, then dragged the shelf back over it. The wood scraped, final and ugly. By the time he led her into the corridor, the estate smelled of extinguished powder, wet wool, and the faint sweetness of melted candle wax from the chapel above. Emergency lights painted the arches in dark crimson bars. A medic passed carrying a black case. One of Adrian's men was being helped along with a blood-soaked sleeve wrapped tight, boots leaving half-moon prints on the marble. Elena slowed at the sight of him, not because of the wound itself, but because the man was young, younger than the hunters who had chased her from St. Dymphna, and because his pain had happened on this property for one reason only. Mateo noticed and kept her moving. "He's alive," he said, brusque, almost annoyed by the need to say anything human at all. "Keep walking." The West Hall had once been a private gallery. Now every painting was a dark shape under low power, and the long windows had been shuttered from the outside with steel storm panels. Rain tapped somewhere beyond them in a thin, relentless pattern. Adrian was waiting near a narrow table lit by one brass lamp running on backup current. The warm circle of light caught the damp at the cuffs of his black shirt and the powder-gray dust on one shoulder where he had brushed a wall or a body on his way through the house. Two men knelt 10 feet away with zip ties on their wrists, guarded and bleeding only enough to look mortal. Adrian did not look at them first. He looked at Elena, not at her face alone, at her shoes slick with chapel dust, at the grime on her palms, at the raw color along one wrist where Mateo had stopped her, and finally at the silence she wore like something built into bone. "You tried to leave," he said. She gave the smallest nod. "To protect me?" The question did not sound tender. It sounded like he was setting a blade on the table between them and asking whether she intended to lie over it. Elena's throat moved. Another nod, this one sharper, angry at itself. One of the captured men laughed once through a split lip, trying to make light of what he did not understand. "She's not protecting you," he muttered. "She's property, trying not to get everyone burned." The room changed before the words had even finished. Mateo's hand tightened on his rifle. The guard by the prisoners took one step forward. Adrian did nothing sudden at all, which made the shift worse. He turned his head just enough to look at the man on the floor, and the lamp threw a pale edge across his cheekbone. "You just purchased another 5 minutes of pain you don't have the standing to afford," he said. No one moved after that. Not the prisoners. Not Mateo. Not even Elena, though her shoulders had gone rigid as piano wire. Adrian crossed to the table and picked up a phone taken from one of the attackers, its cracked screen still glowing with a half-deleted message thread. He held it where Mateo could see. On the screen, beneath a string of numbers and route codes, sat a line so short it looked casual. "If asset moves, escalate against Varela." Adrian locked the screen and set the phone down with deliberate care. The sound it made on the wood was softer than a coin and somehow more final. He had already known she was bait. Now he knew she had seen it too. That was why she had gone for the hatch. Not to flee his control. To accept her own disappearance as the cheapest price in the room. "You don't get to decide the cost for my house," he said, his voice returning to Elena. "Not alone." The lamp trembled slightly as the backup current faltered, throwing gold over her face, and then taking half of it away. For the first time since Mateo dragged her from the vault, she lifted her eyes and held Adrian's stare without flinching. There was no trust in it yet. No peace. Only exhausted refusal and the outline of a warning too large for words. Adrian saw enough. He turned to Mateo without looking away from her for more than a breath. "No more hiding her below ground," he said. "If they want war, they can walk through me to reach her." It was not comfort. It was a decision, cold and irreversible, made in front of witnesses who understood what that sentence meant in this house. The captured man on the floor lost the last of his smirk, and Elena, standing in the brass light with dust on her hands and rain smell clinging to her clothes, seemed to realize that failing to escape had chained Adrian to the truth she had been trying to outrun. Somewhere deeper in the estate, a heavy door opened, and hurried steps approached the hall with the sound of someone carrying news no one in that room was going to welcome. Leather gave a dry creak as one of Adrian's men dragged a hard case across the stone, and the brass sconces along the west hall threw long bars of amber light over wet footprints that had not yet dried. The air still carried rain, cordite, and the bitter antiseptic smell lifted off the captured intruder's jacket when Mateo snapped the case open on a side table with gloved hands. Inside lay transfer copies, a cracked tablet, and a thin institutional file with St. Dymphna's seal rubbed almost white at the edges, as if too many frightened fingers had handled it in secret. Adrian did not move right away. He stood near the center of the hall where everyone could see him, coat dark at the shoulders from the storm, while Elena remained several feet away beneath the brass light, dust still on her palms from the tunnel wall. Mateo slid the first page free, and the room changed before a word was spoken. It was not because of what was written at the top. It was because of the photograph clipped beneath it. Even under the cheap gray print, the face was unmistakable. Matthias Voss. Older than in Elena's memory, heavier through the jaw, but the same pale, disciplined eyes. The same man whose name had already made her hands go cold. The paper trembled once between Mateo's fingers when he looked up at Adrian for permission to continue. Adrian gave him a single nod. Another page. Intake notes. Sedation intervals. Transfer authorization. Not signed by Voss directly, but routed through Esteban Mercer's office, then fast-tracked under private security exemption. Every line was bureaucratic, clean, bloodless. That was what made it worse. Elena's breathing shortened at the sound of the pages. Not panic the way it had come in the tunnel, not the wild instinct to run. This was smaller, tighter, more terrible. Her shoulders drew in as if the paper itself carried a temperature drop. When Mateo read out the numeric wrist designation that matched the faded marks on her skin, her fingers closed around her own forearm so hard the knuckles blanched. Adrian saw it. So did every man in the hall. "Read the margin note," Adrian said. Mateo hesitated for the first time that night. The margin had not been part of any official record. It was handwritten, black ink pressed so hard it had scarred the page beneath. Subject demonstrates selective mutism under direct exposure to supervisory voice. Maintain visual compliance. No male staff to use surname Voss inside observation range unless instructed. Elena made a sound then, but it was not a word. More like air catching against glass. She took one step backward, hit the edge of a console table, and the crystal dish on it rattled in the silence. Adrian crossed the distance before anyone else moved, not touching her at first, only planting himself between her and the open file. "Close it," he said. Mateo obeyed at once, but the damage was done. The memory had already entered the room. Elena turned away sharply, one hand at her mouth, eyes fixed on nothing the others could see. The amber light struck the side of her face and showed what speech had hidden for too long. Not confusion, not madness, but recognition so deep it lived in muscle before language. Adrian's jaw set. He took the file himself, flipped once through the remaining pages, and found the final insertion at the back. A visitor clearance log with one repeated name blocked out in black marker that had bled through thin paper. It was a childish concealment. Under the light, the letters still breathed through. M. Voss. Weakly, Adrian looked toward the captured man on the floor. The prisoner had been trying to stay invisible, cheek bruised, wrists bound, but sweat now shone along his hairline. You knew who she was to him, Adrian said. It was not a question. The man swallowed and looked away. I knew she was not supposed to leave. Adrian crouched in front of him, slow enough that the guards around the wall went still. Not supposed to leave whom? The man kept his mouth shut. Adrian did not strike him. He reached instead for the cracked tablet from the case, turned it on, and held the pale glow in front of the prisoner's face. The last unsent status report remained on screen, half completed before the raid failed. Asset relocated, Varela interference confirmed, awaiting directive from. The name line had been deleted, but not cleanly. The first letter remained. M. Adrian angled the screen just enough for Elena to see it too. Her eyes shut at once, and a shiver traveled through her arms as if that single letter had passed over skin. That was answer enough for him. For the men watching, it was worse than a confession. Matthias Voss was not merely a hunter outside the gates now. He was inside the architecture of what had been done to her. And if the visitor logs meant what they suggested, then the injury was personal, repeated, and sanctioned. The hall seemed to contract around that realization. Even the men who had spent years around Adrian's business shifted their weight differently, because certain names changed the pressure in a room. Adrian rose to his full height with the file in one hand and the tablet in the other, and what hardened in his face was no longer curiosity. It was judgment arriving by degrees. Elena finally looked at him then, not with trust, not yet, but with the exhausted dread of someone watching a door open onto the one place she had prayed never to enter again. He saw another detail in that glance, something new and far more dangerous than fear of pursuit. She was afraid of what would happen if the name was spoken aloud in front of witnesses. Afraid not for herself only, but for whoever challenged it. Adrian understood enough. He turned to Matteo and handed him the file. No one leaves this hall. No calls except through me. Lock every exterior route from the chapel wing to the north drive. Matteo straightened. And Mercer? Adrian's answer came like steel laid flat on stone. Bring him breathing. The captured intruder lifted his head at that, too quickly. A mistake. Adrian noticed. Elena noticed too. And for one brief second her gaze snapped to the prisoner with such raw recognition that the man flinched before she ever made a sound. That tiny recoil told Adrian more than any report could have. Somebody higher than a recovery team was already afraid of what she might confirm with a single look. The heavy door at the far end of the hall opened again, and another guard entered with rain on his sleeves and a phone held out in both hands. Boss, he said quietly, private line. He says if the girl is there, this ends tonight. No one in the room asked who he meant. They did not have to. Elena's breath stalled. Adrian took the phone, and the hall, already silent, seemed to lose even the sound of breathing. Rain tapped the tall West Hall windows in a thin, relentless pattern, and the lamps threw a low amber sheen across black stone, brass railings, and the wet shoulders of the guard who had brought the phone. The private line hissed softly in Adrian's hand, a faint thread of static under the heavy quiet, while somewhere deeper in the estate an HVAC vent exhaled cold air that skimmed across the floor like a warning. Elena stood near the long table with her fingers curled against its carved edge, knuckles pale, eyes fixed not on the phone but on Adrian's face. He did not put the call on speaker. He simply lifted it to his ear and listened, his expression flattening into that controlled stillness his men knew better than raised voices. Whatever came through the line was quiet enough that no one else could hear the words, but the change it made in the room was immediate. Adrian lowered the phone, placed it face down on the polished wood, and looked toward Matteo. Bring him in, he said. Nobody asked from where. The answer arrived 30 seconds later in the scrape of boots, the metallic rattle of a pushed restraint chair, and the smell of rainwater and wool entering with 2 guards. Between them came the surviving man from the recovery team, wrists bound in front, jaw bruised, one sleeve torn where someone had searched him. Another captive was already on his knees by the far pillar, head bowed, breathing hard through his nose. Adrian had not arranged them for spectacle. He had arranged them for clarity. He moved one chair length closer to Elena, enough that she could feel his presence without his hand touching her. Then he nodded once to Matteo. Matteo set a small evidence pouch on the table. Inside lay the burner phone, the transfer record stamped with Esteban Mercer's name, and a laminated visitor badge from St. Dymphna. The plastic caught the light like a blade. "Look at them," Adrian said, not loudly, but the order landed on the room with the weight of a closing gate. Elena's shoulders tightened. Her gaze flickered first to the kneeling captive, then to the restrained man, and stopped. It was not recognition of the face alone that altered her. It was the sequence. The cheap disinfectant smell still clinging to the visitor badge, the nylon restraint around the captive's wrists, the pattern of black gloves tucked into a back pocket. Small things. Ordinary things. Yet her breath shortened at once, and she stepped back until the heel of her shoe met stone. One of Adrian's capos shifted under his suit jacket, understanding before he wanted to. This was no longer a question of trespass on Varela property. The woman under Adrian's roof had been trained by fear so deep that objects could do the work of voices. Adrian saw it, and for the first time that night, he turned away from the evidence and toward the human source of it. He did not touch her. He did not soften his posture. But when he spoke, the steel in his voice thinned into something more dangerous because it was so restrained. "Look at me." Elena tried. Her eyes rose halfway and faltered. The restrained captive gave a dry laugh, the sound brittle with bad judgment. "She won't say anything," he muttered. "That's what they made her for." The nearest guard hit him hard enough to cut off the rest, but the damage was done. Half the men in the hall looked at him. The other half looked at Adrian. Adrian did not move for a beat. Then he crossed the distance in 2 measured steps, caught the captive by the chin, and forced his face up into the light. "You don't speak again unless I ask," he said. He let go, and the man dropped his eyes at once. A lesser room might have erupted after that. This one grew quieter. Elena's stare remained pinned to the floor, but tears did not fall, and no sound left her mouth. That silence had become its own architecture around her, built brick by someone who had expected it to hold forever. Adrian looked at the visitor badge, at the transfer record, at the captive who had just betrayed more than he intended, and then at the line of his own men standing along the walls. They had followed him through blood, courts, ports, and funerals. Very few things could still surprise them. Fewer could shame them. What he did next did both. He turned fully toward Elena in front of all of them, in front of the captives, in front of the men who would repeat every gesture of this night until it calcified into legend. The hall lights hummed overhead. Rain shivered against the glass. Somewhere a cuff chain clicked as one prisoner shifted and then thought better of it. Adrian's voice cut through all of it, low and direct. "Who hurt you?" No one in the room moved. Elena lifted her head at last. Not quickly, not dramatically, just enough for the amber light to find the bruised curve near her temple and the old, nearly hidden scar disappearing under her hairline. Her eyes crossed the kneeling captive and slid past him to the face at the end of the table, the one man in the hall not bound, not armed by Adrian, but still pale as paper because he had been brought in for identification after the call. Esteban Mercer had arrived 10 minutes earlier under escort, soaked cuffs, expensive coat, and the expression of a man who had come to negotiate and discovered too late that he had walked into testimony. Elena looked at him, and the room understood. Mercer's throat worked once. He opened his mouth to protest, but whatever defense he had prepared died when Elena did not look away. She gave no statement, no accusation, no name, just that fixed, shattered recognition, and then the smallest recoil of her shoulders, as if her body had answered before language could. The effect was colder than any spoken confession. Mateo went still beside the table. One capo whispered a curse under his breath. The captive in the chair shut his eyes. Adrian did not glance at his men for confirmation. He did not need it. Mercer took one step backward, heel scraping stone. "This is absurd," he said, but the words came out thin. "You have no idea what she is. You have no jurisdiction over." Adrian raised one hand, and Mercer stopped speaking as if the gesture had closed around his throat. The balance in the hall shifted so sharply it felt physical, like pressure dropping before a storm breaks. Elena had said nothing, yet the silence had named more than speech could safely carry. Adrian reached for the phone still lying face down on the table, turned it over, and looked at the glowing private line. When he spoke, he did not address Mercer. He addressed the man still waiting on the other end, the one powerful enough to believe he could end this by command. "Come get what's yours," Adrian said into the receiver. eyes never leaving Mercer's face. "But step through my door yourself." He ended the call and set the phone down with deliberate care. No one breathed normally after that. Mercer's color drained further, and for the first time since entering the estate, he looked not like a broker or a negotiator, but like a man who had just realized he had been standing one seat away from the grave of his protection. Adrian shifted his stance half an inch, placing himself between Elena and the center of the room without looking back at her, and the invitation he had just issued settled over everyone present like a sentence not yet carried out. Leather creaked somewhere down the long table, a tiny sound in a room that had gone too still, and the smell of gun oil sat beneath the cedar smoke from the fireplace like a second, darker perfume. The chandeliers threw a hard gold sheen across crystal, cuffs, and the sweat now gathering at Esteban Mercer's temples. Adrian did not raise his voice. He simply lifted one hand, and the two men standing behind Mercer closed in with the clean precision of a gate locking shut. Mercer half rose, knocking the base of his water glass against polished wood, but Mateo was already there, palm on his shoulder, pressing him back into the chair. "Sit," Mateo said, and the word landed flat and cold. Elena flinched at the scrape of chair legs on stone, fingers tightening in the fabric at her own wrist, but she did not look away this time. Adrian turned at last, not to the room, but to her. Firelight moved across the side of his face, across the white line of an old scar near his jaw, and when he spoke again, his tone changed. It lost the edge it used for men like Mercer. "You don't have to say his name," he said quietly. "You already did enough." The silence that followed was not empty. It was working. Mercer's breathing grew louder. His eyes darted to the restrained man at the far end of the hall. One of the attackers pulled from the failed breach, then to the phone on the table, then to the door, as if walls might suddenly remember they had exits. Adrian saw it all. So did everyone else. "Bring me the folder from his car," Adrian said, without looking away from Mercer. Mateo nodded once and crossed the hall. The west wing doors opened on a gust of night air sharp with wet earth and cypress, then shut again a few seconds later. When Mateo returned, he carried a slim black portfolio sealed with a silver clasp. Mercer's face changed before the clasp even snapped open. Adrian took the file, slid out a stack of transfer forms, and spread them across the table one by one. St. Dymphna Behavioral Center. Patient Relocation Authorization. Security Transport Escalation. Sedation Compliance. The paper made a dry whisper over the wood, almost delicate, almost civilized, which made it worse. "You moved her as property," Adrian said. Mercer swallowed. It was a custodial matter. Adrian's gaze did not flicker. No, he tapped the last page. "This is a sales chain dressed as medicine." At the bottom of the page sat 3 signatures. One belonged to a physician already in custody from the raid records. One belonged to Esteban Mercer. The last signature was the one that made even the men at Adrian's table go motionless, Matthias Voss. The name entered the room like winter. No one repeated it. No one needed to. Mercer tried anyway. "You don't understand how this works." "Then help me," Adrian said. His voice was almost gentle. "Tell me why a transfer broker, a private facility, and Matthias Voss all needed one frightened woman kept drugged and silent." Mercer licked his lips. He looked at Elena for the first time as if she were no longer damaged cargo but a lit fuse. Because she heard something she shouldn't have. The confession came out thin, rushed, and once it started, it did not stop. Months earlier, Elena had worked intake at a charitable clinic used as a front by one of Voss's shell foundations. She had seen names, shipment codes, and payment ledgers tied to young women being moved through treatment facilities and private transport under false psychiatric holds. She had not stolen money. She had not blackmailed anyone. She had simply realized what the numbers meant and made the mistake of asking a question in the wrong office on the wrong day. Mercer had arranged her disappearance before she could speak to anyone outside the network. St. Dymphna had not been a refuge. It had been a warehouse with white walls and polite language. The room turned colder despite the fire. Elena stood so still that only the pulse at her throat gave her away. Adrian let Mercer finish. Then he reached for the burner phone recovered days ago and set it beside the forms. "Asset." The old word looked smaller now, almost pathetic on that cracked screen, but the damage it had tried to do was standing 10 feet away in bare feet and borrowed clothes. "You helped bury her alive?" Adrian said. Mercer shook his head too fast. I never touched her. Adrian's stare hardened like steel cooling into shape. That was the first mistake in this room. Thinking harm only counts when it leaves your hand. He looked toward the man restrained at the far end. And the second was believing distance would save the men who ordered it. The next command was not loud. It did not need to be. Adrian ordered his men to transfer every document, call log, and account from Mercer's devices to federal contacts he kept for moments exactly like this. Contacts who hated Matthias Voss enough to move fast, if given proof they could not ignore. He ordered Mercer's transport routes, shell companies, and medical intermediaries seized before dawn. He ordered the clinic front shut down and every current patient at St. Dymphna flagged for immediate extraction through legal channels his attorneys had already prepared. This was not rage thrown across a room. It was architecture. It was demolition done with blueprints. Mercer finally understood the shape of the punishment. Prison would not be the whole of it. His networks, his protections, the polished life built on signatures and euphemisms, those were already collapsing in silence around him. Please, he said, and the words sounded strange on him, as if he had spent too many years billing mercy by the hour. Adrian stepped closer until Mercer had no one else to look at. You mistook her silence for weakness, he said. What it really did was give me time to see every man standing behind it. He nodded once. Matteo and another guard pulled Mercer to his feet and let him out, not roughly, not theatrically, just with the finality of a vault door closing. The restrained attacker followed. The hall doors opened and swallowed both men into the colder dark beyond. For several seconds, all that remained was the crackle of the fire, the faint ringing left in the crystal from the impact of that earlier glass, and Elena's breathing, uneven at first, then steadier. Adrian turned back to her, and for the first time since she had fallen into his world, there was no interrogation left in his posture. No angle, no trap. He reached to the table, took the transfer forms, and fed the top page into the fireplace. The flame caught slowly, then climbed in orange veins through institutional letterhead and stamped approval. One by one, the pages followed, curling black at the edges, signatures dissolving into ash. Elena watched until the last visible line of her old confinement caved inward and vanished. Her hand lifted to her throat, then dropped. Adrian said nothing. He did not ask for gratitude. He did not ask for trust. He only moved half a step aside, opening space that had not existed for her in a very long time. The heat from the fire touched one side of her face. From the cracked door, a ribbon of cool night air touched the other. Somewhere outside, rain had finally started, soft against the stone terraces. When she spoke, her voice came rough from disuse, but it held. My name is Elena Maris. Every head in the room lowered, not in surprise, but in respect for the effort it took to bring those 4 words into the air. She swallowed once and looked not at the men who had witnessed her breaking, but at the man who had refused to let silence be used against her again. He took my voice, she said. You gave me a place to find it. Adrian did not smile. Men like him rarely wasted expression when a smaller movement could carry more truth. He inclined his head once, accepting the words without claiming ownership of them. Outside, the rain strengthened, washing the terraces, the drive, the night road that led away from St. Dymphna, and every locked room behind it. Inside the West Hall, with the fire burning through the last of the false papers and the smell of wet earth drifting in, Elena stood on her own feet and let the silence belong to her at last.